research process. We therefore asked teams to make consultation with young people a cornerstone of their research plan. We'll hear more about that from our speakers, including Grace Katera, one of Wellcome's lived experience consultants and an advisor to us throughout this commission. Another important difference is that we asked researchers to meet regularly with each other and with us to encourage communication across different research areas that are often siloed with little communication. As a result, we had some very fruitful discussions and debates that fed into reviews, as well as the beginnings of collaborations that may not have formed otherwise. Where possible, we also asked researchers to review the evidence globally and to highlight where evidence was lacking, particularly in low and middle income countries. Finally, we asked teams to consider context. So, does the ingredient work for some but not others? And if so, why? Altogether, this was a different way of working for me, and I very much enjoyed working with and learning from the research teams. I'm really looking forward to hearing their research today, and this seems a good point to hand back to Andre to introduce our speakers for the session. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kat. That's great. If you've got any questions for Kat and questions generally about this programme of work at Wellcome, then do please put those into the Q&A, and we'll tackle those in 20 minutes or so when all the other presentations are finished. And check out Twitter. If you follow Active Ingredients MH on Twitter, there's a number of tweets that we've sent already that link to more detail of this work that Kat's describing, the website, various blogs that have been written over the last few months. So do read more detail if you wish. Okay, so our next speaker is Josephine Breedveld from Amsterdam. Josephine is the Assistant Director of the Centre for Urban Mental Health at the University of Amsterdam, and she's presenting a review that she did as part of this Wellcome work on neighbourhood social connection. So thanks a lot for joining us, Josephine. Over to you.
Thank you for having me here. I want to discuss 4 main points today. First, what lies behind the somewhat enigmatic term of neighbourhood social cohesion. Second, why we set out to study it as our best bet for preventing depression and anxiety. Third, how we studied it to answer a research question. And fourth, our findings. Neighbourhood social cohesion is a multidimensional concept. There are many definitions, and a more detailed and theoretical framework is provided in the report. For this review, we use the definition of Kouachi and Bergman, which consists of 2 key items. First, the presence of strong social bonds, for example, having trust, positive relationships. And second, the absence of latent social conflict, for example, the lack of racial and ethnic tensions, income inequality, and polarization. In other words, these are the factors that bring us together and pull us apart. What really spurred us on to study this was that we found longitudinal studies suggesting that it might protect or mitigate against the risk of developing mental health conditions, especially after young people experience adverse events or growing up in a low socioeconomic status neighborhood. We also wanted to find new target points for preventing beyond short-term interventions, which currently have limited long-term effects. We really wanted to study what the long-term fostering effect of community change might bring. So we set out to study whether it can be preventative. In order to answer a research question, we conducted a rapid review where 20% of searches, inclusions, and extractions were cross-checked by a second author. We spoke to young people to find out what mattered to them, and we looked online for bright ideas and using an extensive online search for citizen science projects, policy reports, and anything that could tell us more about effectiveness and implementation of this ingredient. In terms of our findings, in terms of the peer review literature, we double screened over 2,000 studies and included 11 longitudinal studies. Within these studies, we found a number of factors that we call building blocks that could be potential target points for intervention, as an increase or relative decrease in them was associated with reduced symptoms of depression, and also to a lesser extent anxiety at follow-up. In the image, you can see the factors that we identified. These roughly also map onto the key elements that we defined with the definition of Kouachi and Bergman, namely positive relationships and decrease in social conflict. As the measurement for these factors was often combined, future research should tease out these to further assess the complex interplay of these factors over time. We also did not find any intervention studies, so we can't really say whether an increase or decrease will definitely lead to prevention and onset, but we found evidence to suggest that this was the case from the adult literature when we looked at neighbourhood regeneration programs and social capital support interventions. We also spoke to young people, and they said that neighbourhood social cohesion can be a protective active ingredient, but only if done in the right way. Also, we should mind our wording, as cohesion was felt as a little bit too wordy, so we have started to move towards using neighbourhood social connection instead. We identified together with young people 4 opportunities. First, co-designing community centres with activities that foster connections between different communities, also intergenerational interaction. Second, co-designing the built environment to create safe spaces to just be, meet and interact, and ensure it meets with what young people really want. We should ensure that we give them a chance and really a voice in the planning of new development and regeneration projects. Third, creating inclusive community groups where everyone can get involved and making sure that these are really meeting the need as to what young people would like. It's also important here to improve the signposting, as such groups are often not really known in the community, and young people said to us that they weren't aware of any community groups in some cases. And especially now with COVID, it's very important to look at what online spaces can bring. We can think of working together with social media platforms or local authorities to create online community boards, or what about some kind of community matching app where we can recommend friends and activities in the area to meet online, but also facilitate offline interactions. So to quickly sum up, I hope that I have showed you what current evidence we have for this core component and the potential next steps for this core component. And we're really keen to move forward with a clear theoretical framework that we developed as part of this project to seize the opportunities where we can, both online and offline, with the best methods available to increase cohesion in our communities. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Josephine. That's great. You've clearly been practicing. That was exactly 5 minutes. Well done. That's what I like to see. Really interesting work. And it reminds me, my grandparents are Dutch, and they used to live just outside Amsterdam. And I was always really struck when I went to visit them in their home in the last 10 years of their lives, because they lived with lots of students. They had loads of students living in this old people's home, you know, and the students had lunch and breakfast with the old people, and they got free accommodation if they did stuff in this. It's very Dutch and practical and sensible approach. So yeah, I think it has we have lots to learn about how, you know, our societies can act differently to the current arrangement in different places. Really fascinating. Okay, so if you have any questions for Josephine, please do put them in the Q&A, and we will come to those in 15 minutes or so. But next is Kanika. So Kanika Malik is a clinical psychologist and the project director of the school mental health program at Sangath in India. And she's joining us here today to talk about a project on behavioural activation that she led for Wellcome, that she's going to be presenting for us. So Kanika, the floor is yours. You're muted at the moment, Kanika.
Oh yeah, I'm able to unmute myself. Thank you.
There we go. We can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kanika. I'm from Sangath, and I will be talking about behavioral activation, which in simple terms is how you can increase your activities and engagement in positive activities to deal with depression and anxiety. Why we choose behavior activation as an ingredient for study for this commission. There has been a lot of research in adults which have shown, you know, BA works. It works very well with depression. It's one of the well-established technique for adult depression. There have been a lot more studies which show it does not only work for depression, but also anxiety, substance abuse, and other serious mental illnesses. There are trials which have shown, you know, it's more cost effective than the gold standard CBT. It has been used in multiple cultures, low middle income countries. So with all this thing, we were really inquisitive how it works with the young people, especially in young people where cognitive skills are slow to develop. Does something like BA, which focus on tangible behavior, does work with them. So with that in mind, we took on this study. As a part of study, we're trying to look at whether BA works by looking at three different sort of evidence. One, what is the evidence from the randomized control trials, where BA either has been used as an intervention in itself or as part of other intervention. What does qualitative study says about BA, how young people like it, and how much of BA is being used by young people in their natural environment. And then we talked to a lot of young advisors from India, how they see the relevance of BA in their life and how they infer these findings. So on my screen, you can see the findings. I'm trying my best to summarize it. What we found that there were quite a few RCTs and qualitative study, but mostly from high-income countries. There barely any research from low-income country. In most of the studies where BA has been used, the target has been depression. So unlike adult studies where there had been a lot more focus on anxiety and other conditions, it was not found in these in our target population. We found that BA was used as standalone intervention in only few studies. It was just 3 RCTs we could find out, but it was used along with other multi-component intervention in many studies. Regardless of where it was used, BA was always accompanied by other behavioral strategies. So you will see a lot of relaxation, problem solving, and other behavioral strategies always accompanying BA. Cognitive was used in few of them, and mostly as secondary to all these behavioral elements. What was exciting to see, there has been a lot more flexibility. It has been used in individual format, group format, and digital format. We found that BA either used alone and in combination with other elements always work well when compared with no treatment or waitlist. But the findings have been mixed, when we compare it with an active group. Anxiety and activation and other mechanisms have been really measured in any of these studies. What young people qualitative study shows, BA actually aligns a lot with how they naturally cope. Most of young people said, behavioral coping is what they usually prefer to use when they are experiencing depression and anxiety. When they participate in these interventions, they like having support from therapists and homework. Some additional strategies, how BA can be improved is like, in addition to behavior, it is important to understand social factors because it influences what activities one can do and what support one can assess, have more target sessions and, simplified material for young people to use. We presented these findings to our young people, our young advisor group, and they also agreed with most of the finding. They liked BA because it was action-oriented and not just talking. They also felt, social factors are important and just not focus on individual responsibility. And they said, we should be cautious that BA should not be perceived as a quick code, do something and get better. Rather, it should be viewed as a systematic effort. They help us identify 3 priorities which they felt from a young person perspective are important, which is like, does BA work with all sort of anxiety, depression problem or to specific one? What is the impact of social cultural factors and how they influence what activities one engages with? And should we look at scaling up BA-like programs in school settings because they're behavioral focused, low resource, and can serve as an early intervention for many young people struggling with mental health issues. So overall, we found a very limited evidence, although we thought, BA will be an exciting intervention for young people. We found very limited evidence for as standalone intervention. It always has been used in multiple other components, but it does sound promising and more research is needing, particularly more research is needing to understand whether BA as a component works or it needs to always be clubbed with other components. Can there be group interventions which are more scalable and digital interventions as more scalable as compared to face-to-face and individual intervention? What are the mechanisms? How it can be assessed? There were barely any research, talked about assessment of activation. So can we use other than tools, some ideographic measurements, ecological momentary assessments, which are now gaining more prominence using simple questions, daily assessments, technological tools, and how overall young people feel about using something like this and sustaining their effect in their daily life. On the screen, you can also see some of the implications for practice and stakeholder involvement, which we could draw from our research. And that's where I end my review. So I try and present everything in 5 minutes. I'm not sure how good job I did, but it would be good to hear if there are any questions.
That's an excellent job, Kanika. Thank you very much. Yeah, really interesting presentation. And it does really reminds me, I suppose, of lots of other mental health interventions that maybe aren't quite as sexy and exciting, but are effective. You know, the work that Dave Eakers and colleagues have done on the COBRA trial, for example, in adults with depression, has shown that behavioural activation is as effective as CBT. That my hunch is that, you know, we don't have as much evidence for behavioural activation as we do for CBT, but it, as you say, is a very promising intervention. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see what questions people have got for you. Yes, please do stick those in the Q&A and we'll come to those in a second. Thank you, Kanika, for your talk. And next up is Faith, Faith Orchard, who is a lecturer in psychology at the University of Sussex. She's primarily interested in understanding the development of mental health problems in young people, particularly adolescents with depression, and with the purpose of improving prevention and early intervention approaches. And Faith is presenting her project for Wellcome on self-evaluation. So over to you, Faith.
Great, thanks so much, Andre. So hi everyone, my name is Faith Orchard. I'm going to be talking about our self-evaluation project. So why did we pick this one? I mean, as Andre said, my background is interested in adolescent depression, and as you might know, negative self-perceptions is one of the symptoms of depression. And actually in young people, we've done some research which suggests that it's one of the most common symptoms, and that the severity of your kind of self-image is related to the severity of your depression. One of the things that we wanted to do right at the start of the project was to try and define what we mean by self-evaluation, because it's perhaps a bit of a complex term. And we've actually renamed it View of Self for the purpose of the young people that we've been working with. But I wanted just to highlight a few key points about what we mean. So we're talking about the beliefs that a young person has about themselves, and this can be both positive and negative. But it also includes how they kind of judge the value of those characteristics and traits. So it includes a few different kind of key components, but primarily it's about this perception we hold about ourselves. So for our project, we started with our expert advisor events, and we worked with researchers, clinicians and young people to find out what they think about self-evaluation in the context of adolescent depression and as a potential active ingredient. And once we'd done that, we looked at the findings from the expert advisors, and then we started on our systematic literature search, so looking at what research had already been done. We found 46 studies that broadly examined adolescent depression and self-evaluation. So we didn't specifically look for interventions, as we weren't expecting there to be that many. And as you'll see from the slide, we actually only found 11 studies that looked at this in the context of treatment. We pulled together our findings from our expert advisors and from the literature to write our report, which we got feedback on from the advisors. So our findings very much are presented as a kind of a combination of what we learned from both of those two activities. So we've themed our results into 3 separate areas. I'm going to show you one by one. So the first one we called "What does it look like?" And by this we're talking about how does self-evaluation present in adolescent depression. And the findings of this came from both the advisors and from the literature. And we learned, as you might expect, that young people with depression view themselves more negatively and less positively when they're depressed. But they also compare themselves a lot to their peers. And they described their self-evaluation as being very complex. So it can differ day to day, hour to hour, person to person. So it's not that there's a general way that young people with depression will present in terms of how they view themselves. There was also a suggestion that it might be important for us to understand the frequency of the thoughts and how important those thoughts are to the young people rather than just their existence. The second finding then that we summarised mostly came from our expert advisors, and we called this "Where does it come from?" And this really taps into kind of the development of self-evaluation and the influence of external factors. And there was quite a lot of a discussion about how it can change with age, and it might solidify perhaps as we get older, but also that it can be massively influenced by our families, our friends, by things like bullying and stigma, but also that it might feed back into depression. So if we're thinking negatively about ourselves, that might end up in a negative cycle, which is perpetuating the problem. The final topic area then, which is really kind of key for the idea of the active ingredients, was whether or not we can improve self-evaluation given how important it is. And most of the findings for this topic also came from our expert advisors, although there was that small handful of treatment studies. And it looks like we can improve it with our standard treatments for depression, but there doesn't seem to necessarily be any particular treatments that are good for it, or techniques that particularly work well. At the moment, we don't really know enough. But what was highlighted by the advisors in particular was that there's quite a few barriers and facilitators that we really need to be aware of. So, for example, young people felt that this is something we don't want to target too early on in therapy, and we need time. And a key part of that is developing a really good, stable relationship with the therapist. So our key take-home messages, I think, are that our advisors generally agreed with us that this was quite an important part of depression, but that it's complex and each person will differ, and they need to be treated on that individual basis. It does look like we can improve self-evaluation, but we need more work with the input of our advisors. And in particular, I think young people really felt like they wanted more direct targeting of self-evaluation rather than the assumption that it would just get better alongside the standard treatments that exist. Thanks, Andre.
Wonderful. Thank you, Faith. That's a wonderful presentation. Really interesting area of work again. I'm going to move on because we're a little bit pushed for time now. So let's have our final speaker and then we can open it up for discussion. But just a reminder, if you've got any questions for Faith on that talk, then do pop them in the Q&A. Our final speaker is Victoria Pyle from King's College London. She's a NIHR fellow and clinical psychologist. And her work focuses on developing effective and accessible interventions for young people with depression. And this talk she's going to give today, as you can see, is on emotional mental imagery. So over to you, Victoria.
Thank you. Hi. So harnessing emotional mental imagery could improve psychological interventions for young people with anxiety and depression. Here we conducted a systematic review, as well as interviewing young people with lived experience and experts in the field. Today, I'll cover our suggested definition for emotional mental imagery, in what ways it has been harnessed in interventions, and when and why it might work. So what is it? So we suggest it's the ability to simulate and manipulate multisensory experiences within the mind's eye by using your own internal representations. So this might be memories of events or images of the future. Young people identify negative images. So for example, I have images of when I was bullied at school. This makes me feel useless and hopeless, as well as the lack of positive imagery. So because I feel trapped, these positive images don't really exist. Even if I think about them, they don't do anything for me. They don't make me feel more or bring happiness inside. Young people and experts spoke about imagery being a powerful part of our mental landscape that significantly influences behaviour. So given its ability to depict, process and generate emotional experiences, mental imagery could play an important role in therapy. So how has it been harnessed? We identified 86 papers with an increase in interest over the last 15 years. Interventions ranged from those targeting negative imagery, so such as imaginal exposure and imagery rescripting, those targeting positive imagery, and those targeting both, which we've called imagery enhanced protocols. So today I'll just highlight 3 of these, which we think are particularly interesting for future directions. So studies on imagery rescripting mostly looked at reducing the impact of aversive memories and anxiety. So for example, aiming to change the power and meaning of an image of bullying. Imagery rescripting had by far the most consistent evidence, with 3 randomized controlled trials showing large within and between group effects in reducing social anxiety. One study also included cognitive restructuring and found similar reductions of both groups. Experimental studies also suggest that compared to something like exposure, imagery rescripting may enable enhanced emotional processing without overwhelming the young person. Studies aiming to increase positive imagery appear promising using brief interventions, but these studies are mostly in unselected populations and focus on mood, so more research is needed. An example is to use imagery of your best possible self to improve mood. And then finally, the studies we categorise as imagery enhanced protocols use different approaches, but all produce really promising effects. And one example of this is our school-based intervention, which we've called Imagine. which combines imagery scripting with techniques to enhance positive imagery. So Imagine shows potential to reduce depression and anxiety in young people. Importantly for scalability, imagery interventions tend to be brief and are likely to be transportable, as they are often protocol driven. So now to think about the factors that might influence the effectiveness of imagery, and I've just picked out a few examples from our report. So a few studies demonstrating that the ordering of components is important. They suggest that imagery might facilitate the effectiveness of cognitive approaches, but not vice versa. There were 2 studies that looked at self-generated content and tailoring and suggest that this could be important. But this was also something that was consistently highlighted by our experts. So for example, someone planting an image in your head is not the same as having that thought yourself. It is not just that the image is there, it is also how it got there that is important. There's also good evidence that imagery perspective impacts on emotional intensity. So for negative images, having an observer perspective, so looking at yourself, might be helpful to allow processing, whilst having a field perspective, so looking through your own eyes, could be more helpful to ensure positive affect for positive imagery. So why does emotional mental imagery work? And here's 3 suggestions from our report. So firstly, our experts highlighted that simply becoming aware of the impact the mental imagery has on our mood and behaviour is an important first step. Secondly, imagery techniques may reduce the impact and intrusive nature of negative images by reducing avoidance, enabling emotional processing and updating their meaning. And then finally, it might be that techniques to enhance our ability to generate motivating positive images may protect against low mood and increase engagement in life. So just to leave you with 2 final thoughts. First, what if, by not addressing imagery, so by delivering therapy only in words, we're leaving much of a young person's experience of anxiety and depression untouched and not maximising the potential of our psychological interventions? And then secondly, what if, by harnessing the power of emotional mental imagery, we could enable young people to move forward from negative experiences and switch on a positive future? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Victoria. That's great. Really interesting work. And nice to have some discussion points highlighted at the end. So it's time for us to open up the discussion. And I'm going to introduce you first of all to a couple of people who are on our panel. First of all, our expert speaker, Grace Gitera from Rwanda. Do feel free, Grace, to turn on your camera and microphone now. Grace is a lived experience, independent expert advisor, working with the Wellcome Trust in this mental health priority area. And she also advocates from experience for affordable, accessible mental health care for all, particularly for people who come from underrepresented minorities in low and middle income countries. Thanks very much, Grace, for joining us for the webinar today. Really nice to have you here. I wanted to start by asking you just generally what your views are on this Active Ingredients Commission, and yeah, what your role has been in supporting it so far. Tell us a bit about it.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here and also to take part in this webinar. I started working with the Wellcome Trust. I think the first thing I did with them was to work with the core components, which was the previous name for the active ingredients. And a colleague and I, Josiah, were among the people who were selected to support, cutting down the active ingredients to the final 26. And we also helped to support the writing of the RFP. We supported we were part of the review panel for some of the issues or some of the ones that were discovered, and then we helped to speak to the funded teams. And personally, on my own, on my own perspective, I was part of one session, so I've been very involved in this, and I think it's a very novel way of looking at supporting mental health. To me, when I first heard about it, I couldn't even believe it, because for many countries, including some LMICs, they're not very interested in, or maybe they are interested, but there's no funding of specializing mental health care for young people. So this was a very welcome but very surprising way of looking at things, and I was super excited to be part of it. Sorry, I went on for long. My brain is not on because I have a cold. Continue.
That's fine, Grace. Thank you. That's really nice introduction, and nice to have your perspective on the conversation here. I think a lot of the projects have really involved young people. All of them have involved young people in some way, but a lot of them involved them in a really interesting way, co-producing the research, getting views, all the way through the review process. And obviously that's not the norm in research, but it very much should be, of course. I'm going to quickly turn to Niall now, who's our final expert speaker. Niall Boyce. Welcome, Niall.
Hello.
Many of you will know Niall. He's the editor-in-chief of the Lancet Psychiatry, and very much interested in mental health research that makes a practical difference to people's lives. Following on, Niall, from what Grace has said there, what's your kind of overall view of this active ingredients work, this program of work from Wellcome? Do you think it's very different? What do you think is novel about it? Are you excited by it?
Well, I think it's a great thing that an organization such as Wellcome, with the resource and the influence that it has, is betting this big on mental health. I think that's got to be a good thing. In terms of the approach, I like the idea of being purely interested in results, because one of the less pleasant aspects of mental health, albeit one of the very interesting ones, is the extent to which ideology is a component. And very often, I think that what I see is that people begin from a particular ideological position, say, medication's bad, talk is good, or talk is bad and medication is good, and decide what works on the basis of their ideology rather than the evidence. And so I think anything which is sort of genuinely open-minded and genuinely multidisciplinary and diverse and consultative, but has this practical focus is something that's to be applauded. My one question, the one thing I'd like to push Kat a bit on, is this issue of active ingredients, which Kat said were factors or components that are really making the difference. So what I'd wonder is, what is the value add of this project compared to what we'd like anyway, which is things that work, which is mechanisms that we can target? What exactly is the value add of Wellcome here? So that's the one thing. And the other thing which I'd like to push on a bit is that I think multidisciplinarity is really important in mental health. I think that there are historical perspectives and cultural perspectives without which mental health research will not be as effective as it might be, with which we won't identify treatments which people need and want and find acceptable. We want multidisciplinarity. Isn't a focus on what works, doesn't that risk restricting things a bit, risk a rather narrower perspective? So those are my two questions really for Kat and for the other panelists.
Do you want to come in on that, Kat? I mean, I guess initially this question about what active ingredients are, how broad is this? Is this a really revolutionary approach, or is it a slightly different angle on the same old problem that we've got?
Yeah, thanks for those questions, Niall. And that's something that we think about a lot. So, what exactly is an active ingredient? Does it add anything? I think I would say that our main aim is to kind of show that it's important to focus on the treatment and the prevention, the intervention side of things. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't have really good, careful, mechanism-based science. But instead of asking, what are the mechanisms underpinning the symptoms of anxiety and depression? In the first place, we're asking what works and what are the mechanisms by which it is effective? And can we then use that information to help improve the interventions that are available? Or can we look at the context in which they're successful and therefore tailor interventions more successfully to certain individuals than others? So I think it's just slightly changing the focus more to the outcomes and the interventions rather than the causal mechanisms, while not wishing to denigrate any of that excellent research that has gone before, and indeed borrowing a lot of that excellent research and the methods involved. As for interdisciplinarity, I think maybe if we just said, right, everybody go and research your active ingredient, don't talk to each other, and make the case for your active ingredient as the one which is going to make the most difference, winner take all model, then that would have been a worry. But I think we've taken quite a different approach, and by bringing people together across disciplines, they've been able to see that actually we need a lot of these active ingredients interacting. We need a lot of interdisciplinary approaches, even when studying a single active ingredient, to understand how it works, right from the practical level right back to the underlying mechanisms. So I think there's really a lot of scope for collaboration and interdisciplinarity within the active ingredients model.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a follow-up question, Kat. Oh, sorry, Niall, do you want to come in?
No, I was going to say, Kat, this reminds me actually of something that Vikram Patel said many years ago in the context of global mental health, which is, what is the bed net of global mental health? And by that, he was using the analogy with malaria, where the big intervention for malaria is the bed net. And once you've got that, you can sort of refine it. You can say, what size bed net do we want? Do we want insecticides or not? But once you've got that, that's a straightforward intervention, which we know works and which we can then, refine on that basis. And at the time, I think the thinking was the MH-GAP guide of WHO was going to be a sort of bed net. Now, whether or not that's the case is maybe for others to decide. But it strikes me that maybe what you're doing is sort of reinventing that idea of the bed net. You're looking for bed nets, as it were.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting analogy. I don't know whether there is a bed net or whether it's one of those things where we've got to acknowledge that it's hugely complex. And one of the things that we think about often is a lot of the research is done in high-income countries, and the evidence that we have shows that such and such is effective in high-income countries. Do we know that that applies in the same way to low and middle-income countries? I think that's a really interesting analogy. I'm not sure if there is going to be a bed net for mental health, or whether we need to think of it more in terms of this store cupboard idea, and that people will have to decide on local solutions.
Lots of kids don't even have a bed, or a bed night kiss, or a story, or I suppose as you say, it's massively complicated, isn't it, in mental health? But yeah, that is an interesting analogy. I wanted to ask a follow-on question that was submitted by one of our participants just before the webinar. Barry Gibbing was asking, again, this is a broad question for you, Kat, around the Wellcome work. He's asking about the various routes that Wellcome might adopt to help young people with mental health problems, and how those approaches could overlap potentially. And he's asking whether you would fund overlapping areas of research and engagement activities that can take what the research is learning and use it to stimulate conversations within communities. It strikes me that that's what we're doing at the moment, but are there plans for other examples like that?
Yes, I think that's a really important part of our work, to change the conversation and the way that research is done. And I think we definitely want to incorporate, for example, a funding stream for youth-led research and citizen science, and providing the infrastructure and training to facilitate that. And yeah, we're definitely interested in kind of meta research, so research that could help us to answer the question of why is mental health so fragmented. As Niall mentioned, it's quite contentious in many ways. So I think, yes, we're interested in research itself, but also in kind of wider meta research questions regarding mental health and how to involve young people in that as well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So we're going to come back to the broader questions about active ingredients towards the end, but I want to spend a few minutes answering some of the more specific questions that have been posed for people. So Faith, if you want to turn on your camera and microphone again, you've got the most questions. I don't know what that's a reflection of. Maybe your talk was really unclear, or maybe it was really brilliant and people are very engaged by it.
Who knows?
So where do I start? Were there any mediating factors that you found in your work on self-evaluation? So people are thinking about sport or social media or other mediators.
Yeah, well, so the literature that we looked at, unfortunately, there was very little research that had done this. I think there might have been one study that had looked at the effect of ethnicity, and there wasn't that many ethnicities in there anyway. And that was the only study that had done it in a kind of an experimental way of, you know, testing that out. But it very much came through from the advisors that there are lots of things influencing this relationship, and I suppose I tapped into a few of them in my talk around things like stigma within the family, you know, so parents saying, oh, you know, don't hang out with so and so because they've got, you know, problems. Lots of stuff about peer influence and good and bad, that, you know, friends are there to support you, but also that, you know, you're judging yourself compared to others. We didn't have anything about social media or sport explicitly. But there definitely was a lot about interaction and the role of interaction. But yeah, all these things very much just came up in discussion rather than it being that it had been, you know, directly tested out in research studies.
Great, thank you. There's a question that's come through from Hayden Kelleher about the techniques that can be used with young people when they get stuck in a rut of anxiety and depression. I think maybe this is a question, Faith, that you can answer, but possibly also Kanika and other speakers. What would you recommend? So
this is generally about if we're experiencing anxiety and depression techniques that we can be trying out. Oh, it's a broad, big question. Yes. I mean, I suppose drawing from my particular project, just to give this as a concrete example, I think one of the things that came out that was really nice from our discussions was that young people wanted a bit more kind of honesty and direct discussion with their therapists about, you know, about how they view themselves. They wanted people to be a bit more open about it rather than hiding away and shying away from that. And I think that taps into the wider issue about us being open and having discussions about what we're thinking and what we're feeling. But actually, the other thing that came up that I thought was quite nice in terms of, you know, these specific techniques is young people themselves talked about wanting creative techniques to help them. So thinking more about things like creative writing, creative drawing, and that those sorts of ways of examining how you feel about yourself might be kind of less influenced by the challenges we have around what language we use, and that actually we can explore quite a lot of things through, you know, drawing and being a bit more creative. So I thought that was really nice. But obviously broadly about being in a rut, there's so many techniques that we can draw on from lots of different treatment designs, and I'm sure others could contribute to that as well.
Yeah, thank you, that's helpful. That seems to echo your work, Kanika, with your young people. Lots of creativity going on there as well.
Yeah, so I think what we found around 34 studies where young people have talked about what they naturally use to cope. And on top of their list was either behavioral strategies or a lot of social coping, you know, just finding someone who has gone through similar experience, talking to them, or just having someone who's saying, you know, it's okay, you know, it's something you will pass. And then doing a lot of behavioral activities, just, you know, break the entire cycle. Surprisingly, cognitive emerged, you know, last of those strategies which a young person wanted to engage, you know, when they are experiencing intense anxiety and depression. So, and, you know, even when we talk to young people, it made so natural sense to them, you know, that it's easy to do something more tangible rather than trying to reflect back and think, you know, what's going on in my brain, should I put that in order? So my, you know, what I've learned from project and from workshop, I think, you know, those strategies, something tangible, concrete, especially with adolescents who really struggle a lot with making sense of something abstract like cognition, these strategies may be very helpful.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's move on to Josephine. There was a really interesting question from Helen Dodd. Hi, Helen, thanks for joining us. About play, children's play, and she's asking whether that was mentioned in the review that you did, Josephine, on social cohesion.
Hi. Hello.
Hi.
Sorry, I've been seeming to having some technical issues.
That's okay, no worries.
Sorry, yeah, I got the question. So what we did really in the review was we looked at kind of first theoretically, so play increases social interactions and it can reduce social conflict through kind of repeated interactions and the enforcing kind of social norms. So we first focused a little bit on that in the review. And in terms of the evidence, what we really found was we found evidence for that in younger populations, but not the 14 to 24-year-old 14 to 26-year-old population that we were looking at for this review. So there is, however, a review that we did find that looked at more the general population, including younger population, that found that play in outdoor spaces and engaging with natural kind of and adding natural elements in outdoor spaces did really affect, positively affect mental health. The other thing was from the workshops that we did was young people said that they really wanted to just have a voice in what kind of activities were being organized, but also what kind of neighborhood regeneration programs were being done. And those should include a play element, is what they said. So there should be some element of just somewhere to hang out. They were thinking of skate parks, other kind of places where there would be a lot of kind of opportunity to interact with other young people as well. So that's roughly what we found, and I'm happy to share some more of the references to that as well in terms of the young people, the kind of younger population literature that we found.
So involving young people in designing and building playgrounds and youth centres means that they get used more by young people. Surprise, surprise. Yeah,
absolutely, and that's exactly what they said. Is just involvement, and what was quite surprising is that there was not that they didn't say that they felt really involved in any kind of neighborhood regeneration activity or looking at redesigning a play program, things like that. So there's really that kind of communication gap, perhaps, in terms of that young people are interested in it, but they just don't really feel like they're getting involved as much as maybe they can.
Okay, thank you. So I guess I'd like to draw it to a close now with a question that I'm going to ask all of the panelists. I mean, it strikes me that this approach that Wellcome have taken with this big pot of money that they're funding research over a number of years is quite different, and it's kind of framing the questions and the way that we work together and mental health science more broadly in a different way to what we're used to. I wonder where you think this leaves us in terms of the future of mental health science. Grace, would you like to kick us off with your thoughts on where you think mental health science should be going now? And really brief, feel free to just say 2 or 3 words if you wish.
Thank you. I think that in light of what we've seen here, I think that it can only be the future of I don't know what the future of mental health care is going to look like, but I really want it to be like this. I want it to be multidisciplinary. I want it to consider out of the box thinking, and I want it to be reflective of what people with lived experience want, as opposed to what mental science or researchers or psychiatrists have said works. Yeah, that's what I really want it to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's clear. Niall, how about you? What do you think mental health science? What's the future?
Well, I'd agree with Grace. I think the first thing is that there has to be the recognition that mental health science is profoundly, inextricably entwined with culture, and without cultural understanding, I don't think that there can really be significant advances. And as a corollary to this, I think that mental health science has to question some of its most basic and fundamental assumptions, some of which are surprisingly under-examined, such as we heard with Victoria's work on visualization. Why has that not been a bigger part of clinical psychology for decades? And when you start asking these very simple basic questions, questioning these basic assumptions, that's very often where you begin to get significant advances.
Thank you. Faith, how about you? Where do you think the future lies? Oh, you're muted.
Oh yeah. I think we need better collaboration and networking, so drawing on all the people that have been mentioned already, the lived experience representatives, as well as using interdisciplinary working, but we have to work better together.
Great, thank you. Kanika, what would you like to add? Where do you think the future lies?
I think it needs to move beyond the domain of specialists, a lot of non-specialists, and from specialized settings to, community settings where they see, there's a maximum need and maximum scope.
Thank you. Josephine?
Yeah, I agree with increasing interdisciplinarity. I also think we should maybe be ambitious and put some kind of point on the horizon that we all want to work together towards. So some type of key point that's what the whole community is going to work towards in the next 5 to 10 years, which we're doing as part of Wellcome as well, of course, but something that kind of brings the whole field together, that gives us a purpose and a joint mission.
Thank you. Great idea. How about you, Victoria? It's hard after so many people speaking. Have you got anything to add in terms of the future of science in mental health?
I guess, so just to agree that kind of co-development is so important, but I also wonder whether what we're really aiming for is sort of a menu of options for young people. And then finally, I think what's really important is getting in early. So getting in kind of as soon as those symptoms are starting to really increase, to offer different interventions.
Wonderful, thank you. Kat, last word to you. What would you like to say now?
Well, I agree with everything that's been already said. I suppose I would also add to that that research needs to be robust, so more open, more replicable, well-funded and well-powered studies. And of course, everything that I've already said about interdisciplinarity and lived experience and a global focus.
Wonderful, thank you. I guess I would add just the fact that we need to get it into practice. It's all well and good having all this amazing science. I would say that, wouldn't I? Because that's what I do. But I think it's really important that we can also actually get it to the people who need it at the front line. So this has been a really interesting session for me. Thanks everyone who's joined. I want to say a few quick thank yous to our amazing panelists. I won't go through all name by name, but you know who you are. You've done a great job of sharing and making it a really interesting session. Thanks very much to the team at Wellcome, particularly for sharing this work, and especially to Kat for giving us a really clear picture about what active ingredients are. Thanks a lot if you've taken time to join the webinar. We've had lots of people online and most of you have stuck around, so that's really interesting. Thanks very much. I hope you've enjoyed this during your lunch hour or whatever time zone it's been in for you. And thanks for people who followed on YouTube and Twitter, who've watched along on the Active Ingredients MH hashtag. If you want more active ingredients stuff, then there's lots of it. I can highly recommend taking a look at the mental health blogs that we've written by Wellcome funded researchers have written these. We published 2 so far, one by Imogen Bell and one by Jennifer Lau, and we're going to be publishing more blogs over the next couple of months. There's also audio interviews and videos and all kinds of other content. If you go onto social media and search for the hashtag, you will find it. So yes, thanks very much everyone for joining us, and that's it for now.